Welcome everyone. We're going to get started in about 30 seconds. All right, welcome everyone. Welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Jay Hughley. I'm the interim director here at the Center on Race and Social Problems at the University of Pittsburgh. I bring greetings on behalf of the Chancellor, the Provost's office, who supports our work, and in particular, Vice Provost John Wallace, who is also a senior faculty fellow with our center. Dean Betsy Farmer and the School of Social Work, where we're housed and do a ton of great collaborative work. We are very excited today to talk about an important topic, given everything that's happened this summer. Um, it's been a very difficult summer for Black America. Many people of color, but Black America in particular, we've had our head on a swivel as we continue to navigate COVID-19 and the racial disparities there, but then also the issues of police brutality that we faced as a people and as a country. And if you, like me, are a parent and you may hear a 3 and 5-year-old in the background at any time, if you are a parent, you're thinking about how to talk to your children about many of the things that are happening. And some of that can be very close to home. You could be suffering loss, you could be suffering grief, you could be hurt by discrimination experiences. And so we have a very important talk today in this season with one of the leading experts in the country that we're very excited to bring to you today. Um, Before we get to that, I want to introduce my co-host, who is a wonderful expert in her own right. And this is Dr. Aisha White. Dr. White is the program director for the Positive Racial Identity in Early Education program here at the University of Pittsburgh, or PRIDE for short. It's out of the Office of Child Development and School of Education. She's an experienced instructor, program developer, a coordinator in areas of media, early literacy, and public broadcasting. She is also the executive director of Rights and Responsibilities, a human rights organization that uses film and other media to focus the eyes of the world on human rights issues impacting people of African descent. Dr. White earned her PhD in Library and Information Science, her master's degree in Library Science, and her bachelor's degree in Media Communications, all from the University of Pittsburgh. And if you don't know her work with the PRIDE program, you should. They do wonderful, wonderful work supporting Black families and parents of Black children on promoting pride in early childhood. So, Dr. White, how are you? Welcome. Great to see you again.
Great to see you too, James, and you too, Rihanna, and welcome to all of our guests. I would like to introduce Rihanna to everyone. Riana Elyse Anderson, PhD, LCP, is an assistant professor in the Health Behavior and Health Education Department in the School of Public Health at the University of Michigan. Her scholarship addresses culturally specific parenting practices to reduce race-related stress in families. She earned her doctorate in clinical and community psychology at the University of Virginia and was a clinical and community psychology pre-doctoral fellow at Yale University School of Medicine. She was a Ford Foundation postdoctoral fellow and Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Culture of Health leader at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Anderson strives to improve psychological outcomes for Black youth through culturally and contextually relevant parenting programs focused on racism and discrimination, effective coping strategies and community building, partnership, and collaboration. One of her primary goals is to create interventions and youth centers which support the mental and physical health of Black youth in urban communities. Dr. Anderson aims to facilitate healing in Black families with practical applications of her research and clinical services, as well as through teaching, mentorship, and policy recommendations. Prior to her doctoral training, Dr. Anderson graduated from the University of Michigan with degrees in psychology and political science and taught for 2 years with Teach for America in Atlanta. She also conducted community-based participatory research at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine in Baltimore and neuropsychological research at Children's National Medical Center in Washington, D.C. Dr. Anderson was born in, raised for, and returned to Detroit. There's something about Detroit. She enjoys all things food, sports, and travel, and is adventurous except for the outdoors. She enjoys listening to and playing music and adores cooking for friends and family, not to mention herself. You can also catch her at Carnival and eating cake pops. So welcome, Dr. Anderson.
Thank you so much. And we also just learned Brussels sprouts is another very important thing. So cake pops and Brussels sprouts for me. Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to see you today. I'm really excited to talk about healing racial trauma, racial socialization as a clinical strategy for Black youth. If you are on the Twitter, feel free to follow along at Riana Elyse. I love when folks are tweeting during the talk and engaging in conversation in that way as well. So feel free to join along at Riana Elyse. So Jay opened us up nicely by talking about this time that we're in right now. We're in a pandemic, and what is that? Well, it's an outbreak of a pandemic disease or virus. So then a virus, we have to understand what that is, and that's a harmful or corrupting influence. It's an element capable of copying itself and having a detrimental effect, such as corrupting the system or destroying data. You might ask, well, what does it take to control a virus? So right now, the news is ablaze with this idea of inoculation or vaccination or intervention, systemic interruptions like addressing the source or treatment as in healing. But the question that Jay so readily prepared us for is, which virus are we talking about? We're in a system that has exposed us to two pandemics right now. In fact, Dr. Evelyn Hammonds of Harvard said there has never been any period in American history where the health of Black people was equal to that of white people. Disparity is built into the system. So we're not just talking about COVID, we're talking about a systemic pandemic that's impacted Black Americans from the beginning of our American history. Said another way, in the School of Public Health, we talk often about social determinants of health, and you see a few of them on the screen here. And often we see these interconnecting systems between things like the labor market or criminal justice system, healthcare system, et cetera. But what Reskin argued is that central to this idea of those interconnecting systems is racial discrimination at the core, or racism as a system at the core of these interconnecting systems. Without racism being central, there would be no way that any of these things could stand on their own. So racism allows the inequity that we see in things like COVID disparity with respect to transmission or mortality, the capacity of hospitals to take in families. Those are the things that are reliant on this system of racism, this pandemic of racism that we're facing. One way that I really like to describe this is by showing, as a mental health professional, showing the impact of racism on mental health and the impact of these dual pandemics on that mental health. So take a look at the screen here, where we're seeing the early mental health impact of COVID in, say, April to mid-May, where this chart is showing us that Latinx and Black folks are hovering at about 40% with respect to anxiety and depression. So in a given year, anxiety and depression is closer to about 13% or so. So we're seeing a 3-time increase with respect to anxiety and depression relative to that same point last year, right? So a 3-fold increase, and we're seeing disparities between races as well. So even though white, Asian, Black, and Latinx folks all had increased anxiety and depression, you can see here that Latinx and Black folks almost have a 0.3 increase over their counterparts. So generally speaking, we're seeing an increase over the same time last year, and we're seeing racial disparity within that increase. That's what we're seeing here. But what's shown when you fill in the entire chart is that after that, quote, second pandemic reared its head at the end of May, where George Floyd was killed, while Black folks were getting used to the idea of the pandemic, we were trying to figure out, how do we cope? How do we engage in the resources in our community? Are we going to be well? So you're seeing that this number is tapering off at the end of May. But when George Floyd was killed violently and virally in front of us, that number ticked back up to 41%. So 4 out of 10 Black Americans were experiencing anxiety and depression after the witnessing of the second pandemic. So there's no doubt here that those dual pandemics have impacted our mental health simultaneously. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, we'll be talking about racial discrimination quite a bit today. And the way that I define that is the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people on the grounds of race. Something that we talk quite a bit about in our work is that at least 90% of Black adults and youth as young as 8 experience at least one incident of racial discrimination per year. But our colleagues have produced literature this year that indicates about a daily average that hadn't in the past considered social media as an example. So now we're looking at 5 incidents a day or more for Black children relative to what we thought of just that one incident per year, that major racially discriminatory event per year. Now we're seeing many incidents even per day for Black youth. Now, we know that discrimination types and experiences can differ. We know that they can happen to an individual. They can happen through perhaps social media where you're seeing other people being impacted. They can be systemic laws. They can be practices of an institution. They can be something that I know is happening that's objectively racial, or it can be subjective. I think it's racial, or someone tells me that it's racial. But the way that all of these different variations of discrimination come together expose that great percentage that we just talked about, or that great incidence rate. Quite a few instances that are happening as a result of the variety of discrimination types. Now, in children, discrimination is associated with more than just these psychological outcomes. So we're talking again about mental health today, but it's not a complete picture until you understand the whole evidence of what racial discrimination is related to. So as a mental health researcher, we know that you can think about what are all of the things that make up mental health variability, or you can say, what's the thing that's most predictive of mental health? So when we think about what's most predictive of mental health problems in Black youth, racial discrimination comes up time and time again. And it's not just mental health, it's all these things that you're seeing in front of you. But we are going to focus on stress and trauma today and how racial discrimination impacts that. Racial stress and trauma, if you're not familiar with it, is the dangerous or frightening race-based events, stressors, or discrimination that overwhelm one's coping capacity, and impacts the quality of life and or causes fear, helplessness, and horror. And these can be symptoms of, as a consequence of emotional pain during and or after discrimination. So well after something has happened, this might come back up for folks. In that way, it's similar criteria to PTSD and can actually lead to a PTSD diagnosis, but it's distinct. So some of the work that my colleagues and I engage in look at how these distinctions appear. So it can be due to an individual experience, which is how we consider PTSD right now, but this ongoing collective experience, this historical narrative, this cellular history that's been within our bodies, our minds, and the fabric of this very nation is something that can lead to racial stress and trauma, unlike normal, quote, PTSD diagnosis. And again, it can be linked to these adult and youth outcomes in academic or cognitive spaces when people are ruminating and not able to focus on what's going on in the classroom, for example. Psychological, my depression or my anxiety might be heightened. And physiologically, so my blood pressure, my gut, these things that are starting to bubble and boil because of these experiences in the world. Briefly, some of these experiences like re-experiencing arousal, negative emotion, or avoidance, these are some of the more stressful or traumatic instances that we can point to that are racially specific. So as an example, for negative emotion, Black middle school students have higher rates of depression in the context of discrimination. So again, just pointing to how are these stressors and these traumatic experiences impacting not just the mental health, but all of these different facets of the life of this child. It is extensive, it's chronic, and it is pervasive. And now I can blabber for a very long time, but I always think it's really important to get a sense of what racial stress and trauma is from the mouths of the babes themselves. So I'm going to play this clip of AJ, and I know our time is limited today. So what I'm going to ask you to do is, while you're watching this clip, while you're watching and listening, to be mindful of three things: what it is that you see, what it is that you hear, and what it is that you feel. So we're going to get into our clinical bag today. See, hear, and feel. And when you see something, hear something, or feel something, go ahead and drop it in the chat. We're not going to be able to take a lot of time to unpack this today, but when you see, hear, or feel something, drop it in the chat with what you experience with AJ here.
So what are the problems that we're facing today?
Oh, racism. Cops killing black people. Just like mostly about like racist. Like cops is killing black people, and the cops that kill black people is white. You ever notice that?
So what do you think? What do you think that means? Like, expand on that for me. Talk to me about that.
So what do I mean about that? Like the black people don't like. The white people don't like the black people. So the cops is like trying to get rid of the black people faster, so they can live longer, but they just trying to get rid of them.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know.
How does it feel when you see things like that?
It hurts.
All right, so folks are starting to drop things in the chat. What it is that they see, a lot of fidgeting has come up. What they hear is that AJ at his age is able to talk about the systemic nature of racism, that he's identifying and talking about the systemic nature of it. And then people feel heartbroken. That's come up a number of times, actually, interestingly, from multiple people: heartbroken, sadness, et cetera. So please feel free to keep dropping those comments into the chat. I'm just going to talk for a bit about what we know about AJ and why we utilize AJ at this time. So AJ, one of the reasons I don't share his age is because when I'm able to really interact with you and talk about what it is that you see, hear, and feel, people will talk about this idea that he doesn't quite know what he's saying, that he's struggling to say some of the content here. And I like to remind people that AJ, in this developmentally normative setting, in a classroom setting, eating a water ice, which in Philly is like a slushie, but we won't go there. I know that the folks in Pittsburgh know all about this, so we're not going to get into it today. But he's eating this cherry water ice. He's doing this developmentally normative stuff like fidgeting, right? So if we know that there's a young person, especially a young boy in a classroom, that might be an expectation that we have. And he's 10. He's 10. And he's talking about systemic racism at 10. And he's trying to put pieces together at 10. He's telling you this aha moment about how there's a systemic problem between white people and Black people at 10. And what breaks my heart the most, and really what resonates with me the most, is the moment that he turns to the facilitator and says, "Did you ever notice that?" That moment breaks my heart, because surely you couldn't have noticed that. Surely people haven't seen this before. It has to be a new phenomenon, or else something would have been done about it. That's what I hear from AJ when he's talking. Did you ever notice that? Because I'm 10 and I'm noticing that at 10, and this is impacting me at 10. And at the end, he says it hurts. So we know that he's being impacted by something that has not actually happened to him, which goes beyond our PTSD diagnosis. It's racial stress and trauma.
So what are
He talks about being challenged in talking about what's going on around him as well. He mentions it being challenging to talk to his family because he doesn't quite know what to do with this hurt. And he goes on to say that outside of the video. And that's because racial discrimination compromises our normal coping processes. So the literature says that African Americans use more avoidant coping only when faced with racially discriminatory events. So let me break that down. It's two findings in that. One, if Black and white people typically use the same amount and type of strategies, approach-oriented or avoidant-oriented. So approach, maybe I'm gonna talk to the person who has confronted me or write a letter or something of that sort. If I'm engaging in approach-oriented versus avoidant, I'm not gonna go to that store. I'm not gonna tell anybody about it. I'm gonna hold it inside. Black and white folks tend to engage in the same types and amounts of coping strategies with respect to general stressors. But there are racial differences when you add this factor of discrimination in, and so they start to use different strategies, which means there's between group differences, but also within group differences. So Black people only resort to that type of strategy more when discrimination is at play. That means that there is a reduction in the availability of coping options. So if I want to do something about this racial discrimination in the world, if AJ wants to do something about it, he's now thinking about fewer options to engage in it versus the availability of all the options for general stressors. What parents try to do, as Jay mentioned in the introduction, is to attempt to socialize their children around this idea of coping, what to do about racism, with racial events in particular. So it takes a separate skill set and effort to do something about these racial discriminatory events because racial discrimination is so unique. Said another way, for folks like AJ, humans have life-threatening stressors that activate a physiological stress response, like seeing a tiger in the bushes. But the problem is that people who experience discrimination are endlessly seeing tigers. So you can imagine if AJ is looking around and seeing police officers and having this generalization of what happens with those police officers, it's like him seeing a tiger every time. He's going to be aroused. His stress response is going to trigger every time he is engaging with people that he feels threatens him. What we do is consider this racial socialization, these conversations that parents have about these tigers or the racial discrimination in the world around them is called socialization. And it's communication between family about the racial world as a means to better cope with that discriminatory event. Now, I could blab on for days about what this is, but my colleague and I are going to demonstrate what racial socialization is through this very corny video that we have a series of mental health videos about. So I'm going to let them take it away. This session is dedicated to the youth who have been killed by discriminatory practices, including
Laquan McDonald,
Tamir Rice,
Ayanna Stanley Jones,
Michael Brown,
Trayvon Martin.
Oh man,
Reed, what's got you worked up today?
man, it's another one of these headlines talking about a young kid killed by a police officer or a dang on vigilante.
Man, I don't know what it would have been like to have race all in our face like that growing up.
You mean like the O.J. Simpson trial or the L.A. riots or Rodney King?
Snap, man. I didn't even think about the fact that young kids can pick up on race like that.
Yeah, I mean, by 3, kids are starting to see differences in race. By 7, they're making meaning of those differences. And by 10, they're starting to think about their own role in that difference.
If only there were a way for parents and children to talk about race effectively.
But there is. So racial socialization is all about the way that parents teach kids about the racial world around them.
Okay, I'm not exactly sure I follow. What do you mean by the whole socialization thing?
Yeah, well, you know how we tell kids to look both ways before they cross the street or not to talk to strangers, right? So racial socialization is about race specifically. I bet you can even think about a few things that your family's told you about what to do when you were growing up. Think about cultural socialization or pride.
You mean like celebrating Kwanzaa or going to the African American Museum or singing songs like, "Say it loud, woo, I'm black and I'm proud."
Yep, that's it. How about preparation for bias?
You know what? Every time I get in the car, I can hear my mom's advice telling me where to put my hands if I ever get pulled over. 10 and 2.
And yet we've seen plenty of evidence that shows even when we follow these rules in every situation, it doesn't work every time.
Yeah, so What about like when people get upset when things do actually happen?
Well, that's also type of a socialization, right? So we call that promotion of distrust. It's when stuff happens and we want to pass that distrust down to our kids.
I've heard some people go in the opposite direction. I mean, talking about the fact that race doesn't even matter at all anymore.
Yeah, well, that's our last category, right? So some people call it post-racial, some people call it egalitarianism, but it's all about being equal despite race.
Great. I mean, that's a ton of strategies. I mean, so which one should we choose?
Yeah, well, the good thing is you don't have to choose just one. Most parents do a blended approach, but it's about the type of blend that makes sense. So preparation for bias and pride messages together typically yield better psychological, academic, and identity outcomes for youth.
So, what should we be telling youth who need to know about the world around them?
Well, the good thing is we should be talking to youth, right? So kids are totally observant. They're seeing these headlines. They're not missing it. So we need to be talking to our kids first and foremost. And we need to be providing them, again, with those blended messages, pride and preparation, messages and activities, so that we can let our kids know that being Black is a beautiful thing, even when other people don't think so. I'm Ree.
And I'm CT.
And this is our Mental Health Minute.
You are young, gifted, and you're Black.
All right, so Jay reminded me that we are award winning, so thank you. We're corny, but award winning. All right, so with racial socialization, what we talk about quite often are those headlines, right? And this year, unfortunately, I can update and create a fresh new set of slides on this virtually every month. We're seeing George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. We've seen so many instances where Black folks have been killed for doing very normative things. The same things that we talked about with AJ, these normative things that they're doing, sleeping, walking, talking, whatever it is that they're engaging in has been enough for some people to feel frustrated by that. And children are not missing these headlines. They're seeing them and they're being impacted by it. The talk as a result has been something that a lot of people have been interested in learning more about. One thing that I think is incredibly just well said about the talk and about both the pressure that parents are feeling in giving it and what children are understanding is what David Allen said this summer in a Washington Post article. And so I'll read it here. I got an I can't breathe tattoo on my chest back in 2015, probably a year after these words were choked out of Eric Garner. My 3 biracial boys have seen it plenty of times, but we've never discussed what it means or why I have it. We were talking about George Floyd recently when my 10-year-old asked me about the tat. Those were George Floyd's last words, he said. But you've had that tattoo for a while. How did you know he was going to say that? I could see his mind working as I was formulating an age-appropriate answer. And before I could respond, he said, "Oh, I know. This has happened before." I want to be excited about the peaceful protests and nonviolent demands for change. I hope change is coming. Really, I do. But what I am is tired. I'm tired of still hearing it's heritage, not hate. I'm tired of still reading, well, how many of them shot one another in Chicago last weekend? And I'm tired of expecting that I'll be long gone before my kids, their kids, or anyone down the line are seen as equal to some of my friends' kids. So with much appreciation to David Allen for those words, that's exactly what is facing Black parents today. The way that we typically measure what David has done with his kids or what a number of families have been doing is through this idea of content. So the things that we talked about in the video, and frequency. So how frequently are we saying these types of things that we said in the video? But there's been a lot of mixed findings. So you can imagine that certain racial socialization strategies are associated with more positive outcomes, whereas saying some things like, oh, you can't trust any police officer, you can't trust any white person might be engaged or might be associated more with anxiety and depression. And there's also this discrepancy in transmission of content and frequency between reporters. So if you're a parent, you know, or you've worked with kids like myself, how many times you have to remind kids to take their medicine or to do something, right? If we're thinking about inoculation, how many times would you have to engage in protecting them from something before they say, oh, I get it, right? So it's not gonna always be a one-time or a one-to-one association between I told my kids and they get it. I'm gonna skip over this because I know that we don't have much time together, and I wanna be sure to answer questions. But the way that our lab is starting to think about racial socialization or the talk is instead of looking at the quantity or the amount of times you've talked about it with your kid. We want to know about the quality of these processes. So we're thinking about competency perspectives. That is engaging in the reduction of stress or the improvement of skills or the improvement of confidence. So even if we don't know if these outcomes are necessarily going to change based on what we've told our children, the psychological process of feeling like we are empowered, feeling like we know what we're talking about, engaging in all of the different types of coping processes that are available to us is going to make us as parents feel mentally well, and it's going to help our kids to also process what it is that's going around them, to talk to us, to feel open and competent enough to come back, to ask questions, to engage in these conversations, and to think about what it is that they actually want to do about what's going on in the world. In a really complicated theory that I'm not going to go too deep into, we'll see that there are some traditional types of discrimination and stressful events that lead to the way that folks cope, that then lead to the outcome. So this is a really basic stress and coping line down here, where there's an event that leads to stress. That stress makes us question, how are we going to deal with it through our coping? The way that we cope is going to tell us more about some of those outcomes that we talked about. So really traditional stress and coping. What my colleague Howard Stevenson and I have done in this recast theory is to say, actually, if we think about how competency of the talk plays a role in this racially specific stress and coping model, we see that the more competent a parent is in giving that talk, the more efficacious their child is going to feel to do something about it. That efficacy to do something about it is actually going to lead to them doing something about it. And feeling like and knowing that you can do something about it is going to relieve your psychological distress from feeling encumbered or hampered by not feeling confident that you can't do something about it. So essentially what we're saying is the more we focus on the talk as a mental health exercise, as something that's going to improve our ability to have this conversation with our children, the better off our children will be as a result of feeling efficacious, feeling like they can cope, actually engaging in coping behaviors and having beneficial outcomes. So that's what recast is all about. This theory, we argue, predicts how well African American youth can critically and consciously reappraise and resolve racial conflict by facing and challenging the habitus of expendable Black humanity. So the more we think about how we can ensure that Black humanity is the forefront of some of these conversations, then that's what this theory is helping us to unpack. How can we support Black people in their striving for humanity? So at this point, we know the problem is racial discrimination. We've got a theory that I just talked about with recast. Well, why won't someone do something about it? That's me back when I was able to get my hair done. It was straight. I'm here to do something about it, and I'm excited to tell you what that is. So I'm gonna spend the last few minutes of the talk today talking about Embrace, which is engaging, managing, and bonding through race, which is a 5-session family-based intervention designed to do all the things that we just talked about. So increase family socialization competency, the ability to talk about race with each other, reduce that stress and trauma that comes along with not being able to do something about it. So again, by improving self-efficacy and coping, we help to reduce the stress and trauma that comes along with those experiences. And eventually we want to improve some of those outcomes that we talked about, like psychological, physiological, academic, et cetera. The skills that folks develop in Embrace are engaging in this challenging racial content, managing the stress that comes along with that through a process called CLCBE, which I'll explain in just a bit, and by bonding. So this is a very difficult thing to do, to talk about race with each other. So how do you improve your skill in just bonding with each other? We're the first racial socialization intervention for adolescents and parents, and we seek to provide support for the theory that we just talked about, the recast theory, and some of the practices that are culturally specific to interrupt racism as a virus. So in other words, we're moving the talk to the walk. Shout out to Migos, who are displaying it here with Drake. So this is the same model for recast, but I wanted to just highlight a few of the things that we do through Embrace to apply the strategies from that theory. So for the event and the stressor. We want to increase the awareness of what that stressor is. Can we even appraise it as racial, right? Do we even know that what is bothering us is a racialized event? How can we then improve our stress management as a result of being more aware of what that stressor is? For the racially specific content, we want to think about how do we reinforce those racial social strategies that are protective, the ones that are actually improving mental health and well-being, and how do we advance things like self-efficacy for our children so that they feel like they can do something about. Finally, for some of the outcomes, we're thinking about how do we encourage things like racial assertiveness to feel like you can engage in coping strategies that are more expansive. And how do those coping strategies then lead to some of those outcomes that we've been talking about all along: mental health, psychological, physiological, and academic. So briefly, let me tell you a bit about the pilot that we ran in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania. We had Black 10 to 14-year-olds and their caregivers, and we encouraged them. We thanked them for their time with a $100 completion bonus and with various things from the community as well, some in-kind donations. We recruited from schools, we partnered with behavioral service agencies, and we also utilized social media, word of mouth, and community flyering. We've developed a clinical manual and a participant guide. So this content has activities for parent, child, and family. It's developmentally appropriate. And these are 30-minute parallel sessions. So the parent and child are engaging in their own sessions. Then there's a 15-minute dinner and a 45-minute conjoint session. So a 45-minute family-based session that brings everybody together. We engage in things like behavioral activation and role playing as well. Just a quick nod to some of the media that we use. So in a conversation about growing up Black, there is a line that we really like to focus on, if it wants to pop up. Uh-oh. All right, media finally took me out. The technology is not on my side today, but this is a video, and I encourage you to look up these conversations about growing up Black on New York Times. There are these documentaries that are videos of families talking about race. So in the video, a child says that he's being hunted. What has it been like as a parent to have a Black child at a time where they feel hunted? And to the child, we might ask something like, how does it feel that your parent would have to warn you about racism? So we take media, the same things that sometimes are scary for families to see, or that sometimes create the stress and trauma, we take it and actually use it as conversation starters. We also integrate various CBT strategies in clinical care. So the TFCBT's practice model, we take and actually integrate it with some of the components within Embrace. And so I'll pop over to the next slide so you can see an example of that. For the A, the affective identification, the purpose of affective identification is to help recognize and communicate feelings associated with experiences of racism and discrimination. And once folks are able to identify and communicate their feelings, they can begin to tolerate those distressing emotions and change the thoughts associated with them. So we might ask families, what recent experiences have you had with racial discrimination, and how did they make you feel? So we're targeting those things specifically, and we're asking about the emotions tied to that stressor. There are a number of other cognitive behavioral strategies, but for time purposes, I'll let you just go ahead and take a quick look at that, and I'll also provide the slides so that you have some of those elements as well. I'm going to also skip over CLCBE a bit faster than I normally would, but it's one of the strategies that we use in taking that affective identification. So once you've thought about how it is that you felt, we actually give you some more criteria to talk through that feeling. So not just stress, not just frustrated, but you're able to give some anchoring to it on a scale of 1 to 10, for example. How stressful was it? So then you talk to us about just how stressful it was. Locate in your body where you feel the stress. So now you're saying, okay, it was very stressful and I felt it in my stomach or in my head. You're able to give more words to it. And then the last step in this is communicating the self-talk going on in your head. For a lot of people experiencing discrimination, we internalize, we think about what's going on with us. What did we do wrong? And so we often say, what if I had just worn ... What if I had just said, what if I had moved out the way? You're thinking about what you did wrong, but this allows you to get it out of your own head, to get outside of yourself, to think about, well, why am I feeling that way? Why would it be something that I did wrong? After you are calculating, locating, and communicating with a therapist, we then encourage you to breathe in and exhale out slowly so that you're engaging in relaxation after such an effective exercise. If we had more time, I would unpack this with you, but this would just be an example of, again, exploring the dysfunctional schema that folks are experiencing based on what it is that I just mentioned in the prior slide. All right, so I'm going to tell you just a bit about our pilot results, and I'm really excited to engage in questions and answers with you, so I'll kind of go a bit faster through this. But essentially what we're seeing here, when you first come into Embrace, you say that I can cope pretty well with what's going on in the world with respect to racism. When you're in our program a bit longer, you see, okay, maybe I'm not as high in my coping skills as I once thought. And in fact, that relaxation is what drops off the most in the second session. So literally saying I can't breathe, right, which is a part of our breathing and exhaling exercise. Literally, that's what this is saying here. It's harder to breathe when you're talking about racism by the time we get into our second session. But by the third session and by the end, families are improving in their coping strategies. And in fact, by the time they leave out, they're habituating. They're saying that stress no longer impacts me as much anymore, and I can cope more effectively with the racism that we're talking about in the session. Qualitatively, families are engaging in a way that it felt good because like we can talk about like what we've seen. So like we won't have anger built up inside of us. So again, taking what's inside and putting it back out in the world. Managing, a youth indicated getting to get stuff off my chest about how I feel about white people and racial experiences was really helpful. And that parent said in teaching him like, you know, this is going to happen, but this is how you react was really helpful in getting that anger out of their chest. Finally, with bonding, a parent indicated prior to Embrace, I thought I was well informed about how my child thought about certain situations. Since Embrace, I now listen more and encourage more communication from my child. So even though this is really challenging stuff, these families were able to bond better as a result of working through this together with Embrace. I love showcasing our families, and so I just want you to hear a bit about what Ben has to say about his experience.
Embrace helped me open up about some racial situations that actually happened to me, and it served as a support group for what I was thinking. It helped me think through what I was thinking, and it also served as a catalyst for conversations strictly about race instead of having race as the subtext of a conversation.
Pure genius. And then this is Ben's mother.
Embrace helped me get to know him better and also be more open to listening instead of being in mommy mode all the time. You do this, you do that. I was challenged developing the words to have conversations about safety with law enforcement and confronting bias in the classroom. And it also helped in conversations we have here at home about our history, ancestral history, personal histories, and when talking about his future.
So there's a case study if you want to learn more information about that family. Anderson et al. 2018 can give you more about them. So just to let you know where we are now, we've been able to publish a number of things about the work, the theory, the intervention development, the case study that I just mentioned, and some of the preliminary outcomes. And we've also been funded to do this work by a number of organizations. So for all the trainees online, I just want to indicate that racial content can get funded, and you just have to know your funders. You have to get a sense of what the funding situation looks like in the world, but don't be discouraged. You can get funded to do this work. I think the chapter of every book on 2020 is going to be But Then COVID. And so our next stop was going to be Detroit. We got sidelined for a bit because of COVID, but now we're working overtime to put it online, and hopefully I'm going to launch next month with our families here. So we have community partners who we work with, the Children's Center of Detroit, the Black Family Development Incorporated organization, and we'll be working with them to launch our work again in January. I'm going to skip over these next few just to make sure that we have time for questions, but just want to show there are not only individual impacts for our clients, but there are things that we as clinicians have to be aware of as well. So if you check out a paper from Salim et al. 2020 that I'm on, we're looking at providers living in this cultural world, and we are socializing agents as well. So we have to be competent. We have to be mindful of some of the work that we're engaging in with our clients. So we have to know some of the same things that we talked about already to this point to make sure that we are competent in engaging with families through things like Embrace or our regular sessions. So again, encourage you to check out Salim et al. 2020 for that. Our goal is to directly work with families, which we've done, to better train clinicians and research staff with the content that I just talked about. And our goal is to reduce and one day eliminate discrimination as a driving force of health. So what we know, just to conclude, is that viruses reduce in harm over time. Inoculation allows us to heal while devising the new strategy. So vaccines can help us to stay safe while we're thinking about how do we eradicate this harm. But we still constantly prepare for safety, even when we know that that vaccine is coming. Like right now, I hope all of you are wearing masks and engaging in safe practices, even though we know that the vaccine is coming. So even though we know that we can't prevent racism right now, we have to prepare the best way that we can for it. Racial socialization allows for this preparation and healing. And the major key is that it keeps children emotionally safe while we're building this vaccine. It's not that we're taking the blame off of the sickening system. We know that the system is the problem, but we're focusing first on the life of our children and the quality of that life. How do we ensure that they are alive and well? And how does racial socialization create essentially a stopgap while we learn how to eradicate racism? It takes a dual approach, both of engaging in that safety and making sure that they're safe through that vaccination to keep kids safe, to keep our Black kids safe. Let's get our masks ready for them. So thank you so much for your time today. Feel free to get in touch, and I would love to answer some questions that have been popping up.
All right, Dr. Anderson, thanks so much. That was fantastic. And we want to jump into questions, and there are a lot of them. And if we're not going to get to all of them, so you need to follow her on Twitter, stay up on our work, and make sure you get a chance to connect. But a big question, I think, for those of us in the field is the fact that, I mean, you mentioned it in one of the chats that, there's no diagnostic criteria recognizing like DSM for racialized trauma. And I know if you're trying to raise money, yeah, there's sources out there, but I would argue that it's under recognized in the medical and psychiatric fields. What do we need to do within the field to make sure we have the resources to do this work and to do good work? Or what do people need to do for us to make sure it's possible?
That's a great question. I think the main thing for me is knowing the scholars who are doing this work. So the work exists. There's a very rich history of folks like Carter and Williams. Like there are people who've written about this now for years. They have scales on this. So there is a history and a literature on this. So becoming familiar with that so that you're able to identify it within your own workspace, within your practice, within your research, and then we continue to contribute to that body of literature. But I think, there's this consideration that there might be a Columbusing, like people are now starting to realize or figure out that there is a need to think about racial stress and trauma, but that work already exists. The folks like Carter and colleagues have been pushing the DSM, have been pushing the APA to have a racial stress and trauma consideration diagnostic criteria. And we have not been successful yet, but it takes multiple generations. It takes, a body of literature. It takes a group of people. So I would just say to go to the source to make sure that you're reading what it is that they're talking about, using their skills so that we can continue to build up this rich literature base.
So Riana, there's a question that has to do more with professional work versus parents. This person is asking, how can this approach be used in a clinical setting or group home where parents aren't involved if the clinicians are not of the same race? So I guess I would preface that by asking you, should it even happen there? And if so, what would it look like?
Okay, I'm gonna try to unpack as many things in that because there's a lot. So everyone is a socializing agent for youth. The youth are picking up things everywhere. So even though racial socialization typically focuses on parents, the literature now indicates peers, media, like mentors. There's so many people who are impacting youth. And again, they're sponges. So they're picking it up from everywhere and everything. So yes, I do believe that we all have a responsibility to socialize children about the world around them. If these are experiences like a clinical setting or a group home, I think it's of course trickier because you're not sure what the parent is also saying, but that's where questions, whether you're a parent or whether you're another socializing agent, I always say ask first. What do you know about racism? What is it that you're observing? And the children will tell you everything that you've ever wanted to know about these questions, right? They are very open books oftentimes. They'll tell you what they know. So I think if you're just asking, what is it that you know? What is it that you think? What would you like to do differently? Those are the types of questions you can start with to get a sense of their baseline. With respect to match, which came up, it would be improper for us to think that it only has to be Black people who engage in this content with our youth. So this is going to be tangential, but frankly, to me, the problem is that only Black people are talking to their kids about these social issues, while other folks are not only not stopping it, but allowing this to go from history to generation to generation. Not what you just did there was hella racist, dog. Like, you shouldn't be engaging in that, young son, right? Or like telling a neighbor, like, that sign is really offensive that you just put it. Like, we're not doing that in other spaces, but within the Black community, we keep trying to repair and heal and feel better. So like, it has to come from other spaces. You, as a person who is not of color, has to look in the mirror and ask, what am I doing to aid to this racism? How is my not talking to this Black child encouraging, racial separation, encouraging that child to not know that I care, that I want them to feel protected, right? To know that they can come to me with those concerns as well. So every single one of us has to be competent to talk to Black children. They have to be comfortable doing that. And that takes work for yourself first. Whether, again, parent or a clinician, it takes work first for you to know what you feel for yourself and then engaging in those conversations with that child. So I hope that answered the myriad kind of buckets there.
I think it did.
One of the questions that came up, and you asked for some more clarity, but around gender differences, and I'll add some clarity, make an assumption here, but are there differences in how the recast work, embrace work specifically, might play out for boys, girls, or people in non-binary genders?
Yeah, so we know discrimination is unique by gender or sex. We know that racial socialization practices are often unique by gender and sex. What we argue, though, for embrace and recast as the theory with that is that competence can go beyond gender. It can go beyond socioeconomic status. It can go beyond education. So some of these socio-demographic factors that are really important in the racial socialization world, again, just get at how frequently people are talking about this stuff. But as an example, you saw Ben and BE, those that mother and child or mother and son combo at the end there, they had a higher SES than some of the parents within our study. And they experienced unique stressors as a result of that. So the type of instrument that Ben was carrying or the types of conversations that came up in school were unique for them. So we addressed competency for them uniquely as we would competency for someone of a lower SES or with a female child. So thinking about how does competency go beyond some of the socio-demographic factors is what I would encourage you all to think about, that if we just become good at getting this stuff off of our chest, at unpacking some of this racial stress, then that's not going to be as important as are you good with your son versus your daughter. It's just about how good are you at emotionally availing yourself based on these stressful events.
Yeah, so Rihanna, there were a couple questions that were age specific. One asked about what the intervention looked like across the developmental spectrum. And then another one asked how do you inoculate very young children to the racism virus? So if you could speak to those too.
Yeah, and I would encourage you all, if you're not, again, to look at the Pride program so that you're understanding how very young children are thinking about and being exposed to racial identity. So make sure that you're engaging with Dr. White on that content as well. So Embrace as an applied program does not work with families outside of the 10 to 14 age range. 10 to 14 is a specific time that not only is identity becoming more crystallized for Black youth, but parents are engaging with them more than they would at other times of the developmental spectrum. So we're really clear about 10 to 14 for the applied practice. But your question beyond that, for recast as the theory, means that we're thinking about how do we appropriately scale what it is that we're talking to our children about to fit their developmental needs. So just because Embrace is for 10 to 14-year-olds doesn't mean that we don't have thoughts or thinkings about how to engage with children. So what we always say is that you would not hand your child a Shakespeare novel at 5, right? They're not going to read it. They're not going to understand it. It's not going to make sense. But that also doesn't mean that you're not handing them a book at all. You're finding the appropriate book for them at 5. And so especially thinking about younger kids, Sesame Street, picture books, all of these things, all of these media pieces that surely right now have list on list on list for websites. So I don't take excuses very well when people say, I don't know what to read my kid. I don't know what exists. We have list on list on list. And again, I'm happy to share these resources with folks, but I'm on several boards, several committees that compile these lists. So I know that they exist of what to read, what to do, what to think about. But the key point is that you're reading with them. You're not just saying it's too big of a task, I can't figure it out, I don't know what to do. You're reading with them. You're engaging with that racial literacy, that content in an age-appropriate fashion because they're seeing it. And it's and beyond them seeing it, right? 5-year-olds can definitely tell you about race and racism. They're being impacted by it. So in utero, they're being impacted by it. Before they even come into the world, racism is attacking them. So you not bringing it up at all with them is like shrugging and saying, well, I guess they're not going to be impacted until they get older. That's not true. Our applied work, again, is just a specific component of the developmental spectrum right now, but it doesn't mean that kids aren't being impacted. So please, books, media, Sesame Street, like engage with your child. And again, ask them, what is it that you noticed? What can we do about it? Ask them those things.
Dr. Anderson, when you think about this work, this kind of gets at a question you answered earlier about white people's involvement in this. When you think about multiracial families and parents that might have Black children or mixed race parents where, it's blended within the family, how do you think that work plays out or should play out? And then particularly if one of the parents or both are not Black and are raising Black children? Yeah,
it's a great question. I know we're running short on time, so I'll try to address this. My colleague who was in the video, our Mental Health Minute videos, Dr. Sean Jones, and he does how parents communicate about the racial socialization they're going to give their kids. So it's less about, again, this is what my race is, and more about how willing am I to have this conversation with my child? How consistent, how concordant is it with both parents, right? And that's the same with various literatures on parenting, right? It's really not about many other factors except, are we giving the same type of message to our kid? Are we together? Are we united? So again, it requires you to unpack first, to know who you are, to know what it is that you want to say and do with your child. You got to go with that work first for yourself. Then you talk to your partner about it, you come up with a game plan, and you engage your child. The last thing I'll say about that is that this is not about you. And I know that's hard to hear, but as parents and providers, it's not about you. Your child is going to be the one that is perceived as something. So I'm a biracial girl. Some people don't know what the heck I am, but they see that my hair curls and they know that it ain't just white, right? So they're looking at me and I've been discriminated against. I've been called a number of names. I've been held back on various things and opportunities because of my background. I am the one, I'm the person who's going to be hit with this racial discrimination. So as parents, you got to get it together. As providers, you got to get it together, because racial discrimination is going to negatively impact me. If you're not comfortable and confident, regardless of your racial background, regardless if your child is adopted, regardless of if you're a mentor or not, that child is going to be impacted by it. You got to straighten up and say, all right, I'm going to engage in this. It's going to be hard, but I'm going to get in front of a mirror. I'm going to read some books. I'm going to talk to my prayer partners, whoever I got to talk to, so that I can go to my child and help them be psychologically well. So that's my push.
All right, and thank you both. And I mean, there are still questions coming in. We don't have time, but people want to be connected to this work. Speaking of prayer partners, someone said, have you done this in churches? And so on the way out, how can people be or get connected to your work? And I will open this up to Dr. Anderson and to Dr. White.
I'm writing it in the chat.
The chat, get these contact information from the panelists and follow this work and participate. And I know Embrace has active opportunities to be involved.
Yeah, and I put my contact information in the chat too, Jay.
Right. All right, well, thank you both. And Dr. Anderson, thank you for coming out and making time for us. And Dr. White, thank you for joining us on this journey. It's been super informative. People are hitting me up on the side, on the text and everything, telling us this is great. So just be ready to do all this good work people are going to throw at you now.
Okay.
Take wonderful care.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you for attending, everyone. Please be on the lookout for our spring slate. That'll be up soon. Take care. Goodbye from Center on Race and Social Problems.